This was the limit of the Roman Empire. Here in the north of England, the Emperor Hadrian built a last line of defence between his civilized world and the barbarians. But by the 5th century, Rome itself was threatened by the barbarian hordes, and the legions had abandoned Britain. We call the centuries that came afterwards the Dark Ages, a time of ignorance and savagery. But throughout my journey to understand the barbarians, I'm finding that more and more of the things that I value have their roots not in Roman civilization, but in the world the barbarians built in the ruins of the empire. Unlike the Romans, they left us no ruined palaces or stone monuments, but their legacy is just as enduring. When the Romans left Britain, they took their money with them. It was to be the last single European currency for 1500 years. But almost immediately, a new people began to make their presence felt. But in 1982, a gold medallion from the 5th century was found in a field in Suffolk. Carefully inscribed with foreign letters called runes, it reads, "This she-wolf is a reward to my kinswoman." The meaning may be mysterious, but the significance is clear. A new language is being spoken, the language that was to become English.
Have your passport, please, sir.
Today, English, one of the most widely spoken languages on earth, is Britain's greatest export. It's the language of international commerce and modern communication, yet its roots lie deep in the so-called Dark Ages. Who were the people that gave us this gift? Where did they come from? I'm going on a journey back into the darkest part of the Dark Ages, and I'm looking for the people who gave us this language and who gave us so much more. This is northern Germany, near the North Sea ferry port of Bremerhaven. The people who lived here used a runic alphabet, just like the inscriptions on that Suffolk medallion. The line between the sea and the land has been blurred here for millennia. Today, a dike holds back the tide, but 1500 years ago, the people on these salt marshes lived under the constant threat of the sea. Now, although this may not look like much today, this is the site of the old village of Pedersen-Weerde. It was built on a mound to protect it from the sea. But then, around 450 AD, it was abandoned. Who were these people? Why did they leave? And what I really want to know is, where did they go? So who were the people that lived here?
They were called Saxons.
So would life have been hard here for people in Saxon times?
Yes, certainly. Probably by the age we're in now, we would be considered to be old men already.
Were they warriors as well?
They were certainly warriors, but they did not face any attack here.
The Saxons of Pedersen-Weerde had no fear of their neighbours, but the threat from the rising seas was another matter. When the settlement was excavated, there emerged the story of a community which had managed to find a way of living on these precarious islands of mud for hundreds of years. Surprising to see these combs, because I suppose a lot of people tend to think of the Saxons as being unkempt people.
Yes, it's funny you use this word unkempt. In German we say ungekämmt, which is exactly uncombed. And some Germanic tribes actually threw them into the piece of land they wanted to own, to make it their land.
You can tell a lot about people from how they choose to bury their dead. The people who lived here buried their leaders in boats.
The tradition of burying people in boats can be traced back to the 1st century in southern Scandinavia, but it actually spread around the whole North Sea.
So who was buried in here?
His furnishings show that he was a soldier in the Roman army. He had a belt buckle that showed that he must have been of a relatively high rank. And when he came back to his homelands, he was buried with his...
Full military honours.
Yes, so to speak.
So if this man was perhaps in the Roman army, where might he have served?
He might actually have served in England.
This man was a Saxon, but as a soldier in the Roman army, he was part of the multicultural Roman club. So when his community buried him, they chose not only to bury him in a boat, as befitted a Saxon warrior from the shores of the North Sea, they also buried him with a throne and footstool after the fashion of a Roman emperor. A footstool inscribed with Saxon runes.
It says Scamella, and it means a little stool. Then the next side it says Lgu Skathi, and it means the harming of the deer, and this is actually what is depicted on the back side of the little stool. The deer has got his tongue hanging out, so in the next few moments he will collapse.
Here lay a Saxon warrior who may have served with the Roman army in England, buried in his homeland, traditionally in a ship. With him, in his grave, a stool inscribed in the same runic alphabet as that mysterious medallion from Suffolk. A runic medallion that had itself been copied from a common Roman coin commemorating the founding of Rome, but with an added runic message. The Dark Ages were a time of shifting cultural identities and of upheaval. We know from pollen evidence that the climate at Feddersen-Veerde was changing. The sea level was rising and the fields were flooding. It became impossible to live here anymore. These marshland Saxon villages vanished suddenly during the 5th century. The Saxons had to move on, but where to? It's a long and dangerous journey from here across the North Sea to the British Isles. Mainland Europe offered little more than a landscape of shifting populations and tribal competition. These huge rivers were once the highways and the boundaries of the Dark Ages. I'm going further north towards Denmark to a place that was once the home of another people, the Angles. The Angles came from the Jutland Peninsula in what is now southern Denmark. It was from here that they moved as the Roman Empire fell apart. They too were a people with a maritime tradition. This is the Neudem ship. It is one of the oldest known rowing vessels from northern Europe. It was found preserved in a peat bog where it had been deliberately sunk in the Dark Ages. And when the timbers were dated, scientists were astonished to discover that this skillfully made ocean-going ship was built 100 years before the Saxons left Feddersen-Veerde. It demonstrated beyond doubt that Dark Age tribes had sophisticated shipbuilding skills. The Neudem ship had a turbulent history.
It was found in a place close to here, now north of the border. And we think it's a part of loot, which has been put as a sacrifice into a lake after a battle which was won by the local population.
And who was the god that they sacrificed it to?
Odin is the god of the war, so he should have got it.
Odin claimed the spoils of several vanquished armies in this peat bog.
We found hundreds of these swords together with the ship.
All the weapons showed the scars of war.
You see these hacks here, these small hacks? Those shows traces of the last battle. It's not a village fighting another village.
No, it's big scale.
It's big scale.
So were these troubled times in the Dark Ages here?
Yeah, I think so. 50 years or a little bit later, after this boat was sunk, the whole region gets quite empty, at least from archaeological finds. We have almost no cemeteries anymore, no settlements, which are difficult to date. Of course, in England appear people who speak a Germanic language, and there are some more than expected in England and some less than expected here, so this makes a sense.
Wie sich die Handlung im Einzelnen vollzog, ob bei den germanischen Stämmen.
The people were leaving. What were the main reasons, do you think, why they left?
One is the climate. It seems as if from the 3rd century onwards it gets cold and wet. Another push factor could be the wars. This is just one example for this, all these weapons. There was a wartime which also might move the people.
And you think that this could have acted as quite a good cross-channel ferry between Germany and
There
England?
could be better ones, but if you don't have anything else, this would work as well. Even this boat, I wrote a simulation program for this, it would be able, in 9 years, 50 boats would transport 30,000 people to England, no doubt.
The computer analysis showed that in a century, hundreds of thousands could be transported. So it is possible that large numbers of Angles, Saxons and others could have moved across those 5th century seas. What kind of ship would you need to migrate? Travelling the seas in an open boat was a journey fraught with danger. Being in a rowing boat wasn't easy, but what was the alternative? There is little archaeological evidence of actual Anglo-Saxon ships, but historic ship expert Edwin Gifford believes they may have mastered a crucial technological innovation. So he made a replica of a Saxon ship to put his theories to the test. So how proud are you of this boat?
Well, we're very pleased with it. Yes, we are really rather proud of it too, I suppose, privately, as it were. Yes, I think the main reaction really was a great admiration for the blokes that worked it up in the first instance, you know, the Saxons themselves. The manoeuvring is remarkably good. I think of a rather long, narrow boat with a straight keel. She does very well. Amazing.
Do you think the Saxons and Angles would have migrated to this country in boats like this?
It's not so far different from this. I mean, the same sort of boat, yes. Whether they had sail or not, of course, is a point of debate. Probably they did.
The sail and the ability to tack, to sail into the wind, would allow ships like this to cross the high seas and return home. So where did they get their boat building skills from? From the Romans?
No, I don't think so. It developed somewhere in the Baltic with boats like this, which were very stiff and strong. And the trick of it is that everything's clamped together with these rivets. There's nothing able to slide on each other. Whereas earlier than that, these have been sewn, or wooden pegs have been used.
Edwin Gifford's Saxon ship is fast, seaworthy and manoeuvrable. It seems to be clear that the Angles and Saxons would have navigated across the North Sea with ease.
Stand by to jibe. Ease your main sheet. That's it. Ho!
So they could get around pretty quickly.
They could be anywhere up that east coast before anybody knew they were coming. The first thing you knew, you had 300 men on your doorstep in 3 ships, saying, you know, where's the money? Or whatever purpose they're going for. Because nobody could travel at that speed at all. And across the North Sea, the same too.
How long would it have taken to cross the North Sea?
Well, about 2.5, 3 days. Yes, given the right weather, waiting in the right conditions. 2 nights. Stand by to jibe. Ease your main sheet.
I have always thought of the sea as protecting Britain from invasion. But in the Dark Ages, it seems it was the sea that joined it to Europe. Britain was surrounded by a natural highway that gave easy access to invaders, leaving the people already abandoned by the Roman legions unprotected and vulnerable, just at the moment when barbarians from northern Germany were looking for a new home. The North Sea crossing points of today have existed for thousands of years. In the Dark Ages, people would have arrived on these shores at points just like this. But was it a mass invasion led by warriors driving everyone before them? Or were they simply a few economic migrants arriving in small numbers, ready to settle in peace? The answers may lie close to where that mysterious runic medallion was found, at a place called Lakenheath. Today, it's the site of a very different band of warriors. It's an American military airbase. Lakenheath has been an airfield for more than half a century, but the area's connections with the military go back thousands of years. Iron Age, Celtic and Roman armies all watered their horses here. The clearest indication that Germanic invaders were here is in the name, Lakenheath, which comes from Lokenheit, a Saxon word meaning the landing place of Laker's people. This landing place became, for many, a final resting place. Here, in the heart of what, for all intents and purposes, is a small American town, lie warriors of the Dark Ages. But not just warriors, because they buried their families here too. These people were pagans. They buried their dead with an extraordinary range of objects, from combs and brooches to fully grown horses. So what kind of things have you found here?
Well, on the cemetery, we've found various objects. We've got, for example, this, which is an iron spear from an early Saxon grave, a male grave, probably 6th century. There are various different types of spears that can be dated to a certain extent.
So if you found about 100 of these spearheads, does that mean that there was a lot of fighting going on?
Probably not. We haven't found any evidence in any of the people, in the bones of the people, that anybody suffered any kind of real trauma. So we think this is probably to say how important the person is rather than an indication that they're going out and killing people. This is a large cruciform brooch, but if we have a look on the back here, this is the clothing of the woman who was wearing it. We're looking at a piece of cloth that is 1,500 years old, which is, I think, unbelievable, an incredible thing to see. The cruciform brooches are particularly Anglian, which is the Angles, basically, who come in and form East Anglia.
Do the Germanic brooches give us the first evidence for Saxon settlement? Or did they belong to Britons who were affecting the glamorous trappings of fashionable foreigners?
The evidence that the people themselves are Germanic is very difficult to say. But what we have are various objects which can be seen to have clear links with the continent, such as pots like this, where the decorations are very similar to the pots and the decorations that are coming up in Northern Europe from the same kind of period.
So it is a real sign of change, really?
Yes, it is, yeah. We certainly know that people are coming in. What we don't know is how many people are coming in and what proportion of the population they make up.
One of the rarest and most dramatic finds in Anglo-Saxon graves is a sword. It was a highly prized weapon and expensive to produce.
We've got the skull at this end, and then we've got the sword on that side of the grave. You can see the hilt up fairly close to the skull, to the top of the skull, down to the tip here.
So the swords are much rarer than the spears?
Yes, they are, and they are almost certainly a sign of status.
I wonder if today's Anglo-Saxon warriors would be buried with their planes or not.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
mind you, the planes are a bit more expensive than the swords and the spears, aren't they?
They certainly are. I don't think it's going to happen somehow. Women dressed in Germanic fashion, warriors with swords but with no signs of battle. The evidence from Lakenheath is ambiguous. But if I can't be sure exactly who they were, I can at least discover the talents and skills they brought to these shores. To understand a people who didn't write things down, we have to search for clues wherever we can find them. At first sight, a Saxon sword blade seems a simple object, a piece of sharpened iron. But the right person can read a sword as easily as a book.
Well, the Saxon sword smiths were specialists in the work that they do, and the swords that they made had this wonderful patterning in them, which to start with was quite accidental because they were trying to get the metal to fold over, and the more you forge the metal, the more refined it becomes, so you get a better blade.
The challenge for the Saxon smiths was to make a sword that combined flexibility, so it wouldn't break, and hardness to keep a sharp edge. They achieved this with the extraordinary pattern-welded sword.
In a Saxon sword blade, there are 4 different types of iron, and each type of iron is specific to doing a job in that blade. Cutting edges that go all the way around the blade and are welded in are made out of non-phosphoric iron and a medium carbon steel, so that you get a hard cutting edge. There's the first weld, just to get the ends fixed together. Now I'm going to put it back in again, take another welding heat and start welding back. If a Saxon smith came into this workshop now, he would know exactly what I was doing.
And he'd feel right at home.
He would say, but you don't want to do it that way.
I can teach you better.
They were making this sort of structured blade 600 years before the Japanese started. We go on about the Japanese samurai blades. They were doing it 600 years earlier.
So the Saxons beat the samurai to this.
Yeah. You can see that this is an X-ray of an actual Saxon sword, and you can see the patterning in it. To get your patterns, you twist your metal. And when you've done all these, you then weld those 4 together into one piece.
So from start to finish, how long does it take to make a Saxon sword?
I would say on the average somewhere around about 80 hours work to forge the sword.
At the end of a man's life, what would happen to his sword?
This is the fascinating thing about it, is that they buried them with them. A precious weapon like that, and it went with him. And this is how we find them today, but we don't find that many.
So the swords reveal a people skillfully working with a technology far more advanced than we might have expected in the Dark Ages.
And these blades, when they were finished and sharpened up, they literally would cut a man in half. They would take arms off, they would take legs off, and there is a recorded incident of someone cleaving his opponent from his collarbone right through to his hip.
So they worked.
They worked, yeah. You see now, Richard, this is the blade that has been ground and polished, and what we're going to do is bring out the pattern by using an acid. Starting to come through up here.
It's like watching a photograph developing. What do you think of the fact that such a thing of beauty can have such a destructive effect?
That is the sad part about it all, really. I tend not to dwell on that. I look at it as a work of art made by a craftsman that knows his job.
The Anglo-Saxon craftsmen were highly skilled in metalwork, but because their ships and houses were built in wood, they have left us with little more than shadows on the ground. I want to know more about the ideas they brought and discover whether, as my old school books claimed, they lived in hunger, poverty and dirt. Did the Angles and Saxons who came to these islands 1500 years ago come in force displacing a local population, or did they arrive in small numbers eager to assimilate? A chance discovery in this North Yorkshire sand quarry offers some surprising answers.
Right, we came here first in 1978 because someone found an Anglo-Saxon grave during quarrying. And so we came in, started the excavation, but it was a time when there was virtually no evidence of settlement. One of the big problems of Anglo-Saxon England, it was populated by dead people. There were no living.
Just cemeteries.
Just cemeteries.
But at West Heslington, for the first time, they have documented an entire Anglo-Saxon world, although there's nothing to see on the surface.
For the first time, we've managed to excavate a complete cemetery and a complete settlement. For the most part, we have the most complete picture of an early to Middle Saxon settlement that we have from anywhere in this country. Now, we're coming into the cemetery from the eastern side, and this sort of platform here was occupied by a major Neolithic monument, a henge with a ditch and bank around it, and entrances on either side. So yes, there's a real corker. This is a real traditional Anglo-Saxon burial, this one.
Just as at Lakenheath, this site shows a continuity of occupation since the Iron Age. The cemetery contains 220 burials, uncovering 4 centuries of Anglo-Saxon settlement. 2 burials in particular challenge conventional expectations about Anglo-Saxon men and women.
We have a female burial with 2 spears, and then we have a very definite male burial with brooches and beads. What we can be sure of is that the traditional view of, this one's got lots of brooches, it must be a girlie, and this one's got weapons, it's a chap, is no longer acceptable.
So, how do you know they were Saxons?
The population in this part of the country we would consider to be Anglians rather than Saxons. How many of them are actually continental? It's certainly not more than 20%.
There was a population of perhaps 1.5 million people on these islands when the Romans left. Just how many migrants would it take to make a major impact?
I'm quite happy that we are dealing with relatively small numbers of people, but maybe arriving over quite a long time, maybe over 200 years. But the real problem is then, why does everybody then look like an Anglo-Saxon when we dig them up? I believe that we can explain away the rapid adoption of Anglo-Saxonness on the grounds that it was a deliberate attempt to break those Roman traditions.
So how many people do you think would have lived there at any one time?
Probably about 100. We've got about 200 buildings, but of course they're spread over 400 years of activity.
Yes.
But the plan of the settlement shows tremendous organisation. So the centre of town, I think, was this bit down here.
This was downtown.
Yeah.
All the houses here seem to have been planned to the same few designs.
It's almost as if there's an Anglo-Saxon Mr. Wimpy or Mr. Barrett out there who has a book of building plans, and you choose whichever one you like. It's interesting enough that that occurs on this site, but it's quite remarkable that that occurs throughout early Anglo-Saxon England. They had plenty of meat to eat, all round a good and varied diet. They're eating wild fowls and they're hunting and gathering as well as growing crops out in the fields. And they're managing that landscape as well.
So it doesn't sound really like the Dark Ages.
No, I think the Dark Ages is the worst accident of naming that's happened to the past. It's a ridiculous concept. They were doing terribly fine. I mean, just one object. We had 800,000 animal bones. This is just a cattle toe bone.
Is that a cat?
Yep.
So this is a kind of equivalent to a China cat that people buy today. They put it on the mantelpiece.
Or somebody's just carved it for fun. When we started working here, the view of early Anglo-Saxon England was of a primitive pagan society living in scruffy little farmsteads, eking out a living in the land. We now have huge villages populated by relatively well-off people that are clearly in communication and trade with people not only in this country but abroad. And without that sophistication at this point, Anglo-Saxon England could never have developed.
The trading routes of the Dark Ages were the seaborne routes of ideas and skills, and the traffic was not just one way. Whatever we call them, and they certainly didn't call themselves Anglo-Saxons, these newcomers from the east were to dominate life on these islands for 400 years. West Stow in Suffolk is the site of an early Anglo-Saxon village. I've come here because I want to try and get a sense of what it felt like to be an Anglo-Saxon. And it seems to me that the reconstructed village of West Stow is a pretty good place to start. West Stow was an early Anglo-Saxon village in a landscape that had been managed for hundreds of years. It would have been self-sufficient at a time when markets and towns were unknown to the newcomers. Today's Anglo-Saxons are part-time enthusiasts.
We think that at any one time there are around about 30-ish people living here, probably an extended family, probably of 3 generations. It seems reasonable to think there were similar settlements in the area.
Nice thing about this, it's rather like the Black & Decker workmate of its time. Yeah. Except, of course, here you can move the wood around any direction you like and grip it immediately.
They were anything but crude. Their knowledge of the material they were working with was immense. Their skills were immense. You've only got to look at some of the metalwork and some of the woodwork and the jewellery and stuff from the period. If I've got to live at any time during the Dark Ages in any place, I think I'd quite happily settle for here.
The village appears isolated today, but in Saxon times it would have had close links with the outside world as part of the largest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, East Anglia.
This is a cowrie shell, which you're probably familiar with. And this, of course, has come from the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean. And I think it's important to realise that a village like this was not totally out of touch with the rest of the world. Somebody, somehow, got things like this and things like ivory, and possibly also the garnets, which may be in this brooch. It's a Frankish brooch, not an Anglo-Saxon brooch at all. This is a bit strange, isn't it? It's an iron thing, and it's obviously possibly a key. I think this one could have functioned as a key, but there are a lot of much bigger ones made of bronze with quite elaborate ornaments on them, and they're usually called girdle hangers. And the fact that a woman is buried with a bunch of these things shows that she was a woman who had some authority. Women had rather more independence than they had had in the previous Roman period, or indeed perhaps than they were to have in the later post-conquest Norman period.
Life in Anglo-Saxon Britain was not always peaceful. With many kingdoms in competition, there would have been occasions when the men of the village would have been called to arms.
Yep. Anyway, the shot they'd be aiming for, judging from the skeletal evidence, is to bring a blow in onto the skull, towards the front of it with the tip of the sword, so it cuts down through the skull to just above the eye, and hopefully that's enough to destroy your enemy's brain and kill him without you actually getting your sword jammed in his head.
I wouldn't want to inconvenience you by doing that.
The Anglo-Saxons themselves, I think there's a lot of stuff that they've left us in our culture nowadays, things like sense of humour and our attitude towards things, and the sense of humour that you see in things like the riddles and the poems is the same sort of stuff you find in things like carry-on movies and things like this. It's all the innuendos and the double entendres and things like that.
There's one about an onion and how unpeeling it makes a woman weep, that kind of thing. And there are a lot of others which I'm not prepared to go into on screen in a family programme.
Such as?
Well, you know, if I was going to be completely Anglo-Saxon, I could say I'm just going to go and take a piss or a shit or whatever, and of course it wouldn't be as crude, it was just the word itself.
The word they used.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxons didn't bring books. Their stories, myths, laws and legends were carried with them in their heads. Their greatest legacy to England is the language.
Is that why the Saxons had so many combs? Yeah. Get the nits out.
Clean hair. You and I are speaking to each other in English. And that English, although I think it would have been difficult for an original inhabitant of West Stow to understand us, is nonetheless the same language. We don't speak Latin, we don't speak French, we speak English. And that's the language that arrived here in the 5th century with the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes and all the rest.
The echoes of our past still resonate today. Most of the words in English have Anglo-Saxon origins. Even the name England is derived from Angle.
Chwet, we gardena in Jerdagum. Theotkunningas Rumjufrunon, Huda Evelingas Ellen Fremedon.
In the 7th century, the villagers of West Stow were caught up in a crisis that was to change the culture of England forever. The seas that brought their ancestors now ferried Christian missionaries from Ireland and Rome. The Anglo-Saxon world was about to be caught up in a battle between a pagan past and a Christian future. The Anglo-Saxon tribes who came to these shores left little to mark their presence, but perhaps their greatest secret lay buried beneath the earth for 1,300 years.
I've been trying to peel away the myths and legends that surround the Dark Ages, and now I've come to the British Museum, this great temple of classical architecture, because within its walls lies the spirit of a society that can still dazzle us today.
By the 7th century, there were 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms vying for supremacy, all with kings armed with family trees to prove their legitimacy, claiming ancestry from both Roman Caesar and Odin, the pagan god of war. Anglo-Saxon society was transformed by the arrival of Christian missionaries. The notion of one god and one king would provide a powerful force for change. This is the Sutton Hoo treasure, the crown jewels of the Anglo-Saxon world and the grave goods of a pagan king. And they reveal the struggles of that crucial moment in English history.
This isn't the kind of thing a person would normally expect to associate with the Dark Ages. The workmanship's fantastic.
No, it's absolutely amazing. No, I mean, this is your real top-of-the-market object. I mean, the workmanship on it, the way the garnets are cut, you can see here, and the way they've set blue stone, mille-fiori, blue glass, in as precious jewels. I mean, it's quite a remarkable piece. We say it's a shoulder clasp, a pair of shoulder clasps, and they would have been worn literally on the shoulder like this. It opens on a hinge. If I just break it like this, you can see the hinge coming up. There's no doubt that the shoulder clasps are made en suite, if you like, with the purse lid, certainly. And then if you accept that the purse is worn on the belt that carries the great gold buckle, you've got these 3 extraordinary pieces of, I mean, what you could call sort of civil ceremonial gear, which are in direct contrast to the helmet, the shield, and the sword. I mean, all this is an expression of disposable wealth and a sort of confidence in the continuation, if you like, of a dynasty. I mean, it's the king is dead, long live the king. We can afford to put all this stuff in the grave.
The Sutton Hoo treasure is an expression of early Anglo-Saxon kingship. The body of the king was never found, but the burial has been dated to 625, suggesting that here lay King Redwald, the last of the pagan kings and the first overlord of England. Just 8 generations after their ancestors came to these shores, the Anglo-Saxons would have to make a choice between their old pagan gods and a new Christian empire.
The River Deben is a quiet backwater, a place that time seems to have forgotten. But in Anglo-Saxon times, it was a busy thoroughfare and the heart of a powerful kingdom. The estuaries of Suffolk were just a short hop across the North Sea to the mouth of the Rhine, Europe's busiest artery. This was the front door, not just to East Anglia, but to the whole of Britain.
It was from this river 1400 years ago that a royal sailing barge was hauled up onto the shore. It was then dragged up a 300-metre slope to the ridge above, where it was to become a coffin fit for a king. At the edge of this plateau, overlooking the estuary of the River Deben, lies a group of low circular mounds, These are the Sutton Hoo burial grounds.
There may be no crumbling ruins or mysterious stone monuments here, but the simplicity of this site belies its importance, because it represents a turning point in English history.
Superstition and myth had haunted this place for centuries. Mrs. Pretty, who owned the land, claimed to have seen shadowy figures on the mounds at night. She decided to go digging. The first of a long series of excavations began with the opening of 3 mounds. All had been robbed. On the eve of World War II, the largest mound was excavated. They found not a ship, but the shadow of a ship in the sand. No wood had survived, though its shape had been preserved in its sandy tomb for nearly 1400 years. At its heart, the king's treasure still remained virtually intact.
This is Mound 2, Richard, which we've reconstructed. So we're now walking down into its quarry ditch here, which we excavated to start with.
That's a great view, yeah.
There are 18 mounds that we know about. You see, they're quite spread out, and originally much higher. So quite a grand monument with a strong profile that you could see from the river. The people who were living here definitely had ancestral connections. I mean, whether or not you believe in large-scale or small-scale migrations, I don't think there's any doubt that the Angles of East Anglia were related or had relatives and may even still have had land in places like Jutland and Denmark. They were in contact, yeah. I see boats going up and down this river, visiting those other places. This is the reconstructed Mound 1, the famous one, and that's where the ship was. And the ship stretched from here, this white post, to the other white post, which you see there. So that's 90 feet, 27 meters, and these 2 posts, modest indication, but they show you how big this boat was. We've got to think of ourselves as down at ground level and walking along the side of the boat, and then in the middle is this big, it's like a big wooden garden shed, probably with a slopey roof. And then you're looking down into a chamber, and there's a floor, and then on the floor there's a man lying. The man is lying here, with his feet that way to the east, and his head here. And at this end of the chamber, you have the sort of regalia, the scepter, the standard. His shield is up against the wall of the chamber. And then the sword, and then the helmet about here, which then broke into lots of pieces. A pile of silver bowls, and then bundles of spears, so all the weaponry is up that end. It's like a poem, an important statement made in this great theatre of death you've got here. Each of these objects is also laden with symbolism. So you have things like the great gold buckle with its writhing snakes, which say, back off, I am protecting this person. And you've got the shoulder clasps with their beautiful inlaid garnets, which say, this is a person for whom, of whom the Roman army would have been proud. And then you have piles of silver bowls which are made in Constantinople, and these say, and they're of the same rank. They're in equal terms with the Byzantine emperor. So the whole thing is full of allusions: boats, travel, gold, riches, power, leadership, contact, Scandinavia, our friends across the North Sea, France, our friends, or perhaps our enemies, across the Channel.
30 years after the first Christian missionaries arrived from Rome, most of England was converted, but not all the kingdoms embraced its potent message.
This is the pivotal moment, I think, that's expressed here. It is very short-lived. And that is the cusp between the pagan world and the Christian world. On the one hand lies autonomy and freedom. On the other hand, in Europe there lies huge opportunities for trade, and for that you have to surrender something of your sovereignty. I think at that point there were battles. And maybe it's battle that does decide. If the God mighty in battle is on your side, then that's a sign of what the future ought to be.
The future lay with the Christian kings. Soon there was to be one God and one king ruling England.
So this is, for me, one last demonstrative occasion, an attempt to build a pagan kingdom in East Anglia. And that's why these mounds have been captured here. That's why it's such a sort of precious monument for us.
The moment passed, East Anglia became Christian, and Sutton Hoo was left as a place of myth and legend, but one which held darker secrets alongside its treasures. Victims garroted, beheaded and occasionally dismembered lie in clusters around the unconsecrated burial mounds. Their bodies decayed, but their dying agonies are frozen as shadows in the sand. Sutton Hoo had become an execution ground.
So these burials round Mine 5 were not human sacrifices, but they were people who were hanged by the Christian kings, perhaps for being deviant or disobeying the new rules. And this became a savage place. What had once been the burial ground of kings became a place of execution for the new regime.
The combination of kingship and Christianity would transform the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and forge the English nation. The Anglo-Saxon signature is indelibly written in the patterns of the English landscape, in our maps and our manuscripts, our dictionaries and our culture. But who were they? It seems there is no easy answer. Immigrants and the local British together created a culture and place we call Anglo-Saxon England. They didn't live in a dark age. It was an age of opportunity and change. Its engine was trade and the merging of ideas and people. They acknowledged their debt to the past and saw in the future possibilities. But soon their world would be overwhelmed by new ideas and new waves of barbarians from the East.